Now that we've got Tailwind set up on our project, let's try to actually build something with it. So we're going to build this really simple splash page for a make-believe website called Workation. Let's head back to the code and get started. First, let's delete this heading that we kind of have hanging around from the previous video. And why don't we start by adding a background color to this page? So to add a background color in Tailwind, all we need to do is add a utility class that sets the background color. So all of Tailwind's background color utilities start with BG-, and you can see we have options like transparent, black, white, a large set of grays, a set of reds, oranges, yellows, greens, teals, blues, all sorts of colors. For this design, why don't we use a really light gray? So you can see that we have a numbering system here where 100 is the lightest shade, all the way down to 900, which is the darkest shade. And this is the same across all the colors in the color palette. So 900 is always the darkest, 100 is always the lightest. Why don't we go with 100, which is a really light gray, just barely off white, and see how that looks. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Next, why don't we pull in the logo that we saw in the finished design. So I've already got the logo over here in the left in the sidebar. I pulled it into public, img logo.svg. So let's just add an image tag here. We'll pull in img logo.svg. We'll add some alt text, workation, and we should see that pop up. There we go. Now I don't love that the image goes all the way to the edges of the page, so why don't we add some padding around this? So I'm going to create a new container here. We'll move the image up into this container, and we can add the padding to the div itself. So the way that we add padding in Tailwind is using padding utilities. So we can just add a class attribute here, and then all the padding utilities are just p dash and then a number that comes from Tailwind's built-in spacing scale. So the spacing scale starts at 0 and goes all the way up to 64, where 0 is of course literally 0, and then 1 is 0.25 rem, which is the equivalent of 4 pixels using the default font size in the browser, and then every other number just scales proportionally to this one. So 2 is twice as much padding as 1, 3 is 3 times as much padding as 1, 10 is 10 times as much padding as 1. And you can see there's a couple gaps in the scale because we don't want you sort of fine-tuning 4 pixels when you're at really large sizes. That's not useful and can actually make it harder to put together a nice design when you have too many choices. So we try to give you just the right number of choices by default so you can sort of fine-tune things at the low end of the scale, but at the bigger end of the scale, you're choosing between bigger gaps, so you're not worrying about 1 pixel here or there. Why don't we try something like P8 and see how that looks? Yeah, it's a reasonable amount of padding. Now say we wanted a different amount of horizontal padding than we did vertical padding. We can set just the horizontal padding in Tailwind by using the px utilities. Then we can set the vertical padding using the py utilities. I think this looks pretty good. Now what about the image size? The logo goes full width here and is a little bit taller than it was in the finished design. Why don't we try and shrink this down and assign it a smaller height? We can give this image a height using Tailwind's height utilities. So the height utilities are just h dash and then a value from the same spacing and sizing scale that we talked about already. So this can be as small as h1, which is of course really tiny, all the way up to something like h32 or even larger. Why don't we try something like h10 and see how that looks? Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Next, let's pull in that nice splash image we had of that woman working on the beach. So I'll add another image tag here and I'll pull that in from img/beachwork.jpg. I'll give this some alt text of woman workationing on the beach. And we should see that pop in. Yeah, there we go. First things first, it's a little bit too tight to the logo. So why don't we add some margin to space those out? So I'm going to add a class here. Now to add some top margin in Tailwind, all we need to do is say MT for margin top, and then again choose a value from that same spacing scale that's used throughout the entire framework. So we could try something like MT4, maybe that's still a little bit too tight. Why don't we try MT6? Yeah, I think that looks good. Next, what about the square corners? In the finished design, we had these nice, soft, rounded corners. Well, to add some border radius in Tailwind, all we need to do is use the rounded utility. So this is going to add sort of a medium default border radius. We can tighten that up a little bit by using rounded SM, so that'll be a little bit tighter of a border radius. Or we can make it a nice big fat border radius using rounded LG, and I think this looks great. Now what about a shadow to sort of elevate this image off the page a little bit? If we want to add a box shadow, all we need to do is add a shadow class. And this is going to add a small, subtle shadow. Now these shadows go all the way up to shadow 2XL, which is a much larger, more diffused shadow. For our purposes, I think we want a pretty big shadow, but maybe not the biggest. So why don't we try shadow XL? Yeah, that looks pretty good to me. Okay, now what about sort of the tagline? In the finished design, we had this tagline underneath the image here, sort of like the H1 for the page. So why don't we add an H1 and drop in the content here? You can work from anywhere, take advantage of it. Great, now you can see we have that sort of completely unstyled heading over here by default, ready for us to style with whatever classes we want. So let's add some utilities to kind of bring this to life. So first things first, let's add a little bit of top margin like we did for the image to spread things out a little bit. So why don't we go with MT6 to kind of use the same spacing on both sides. And now let's try and assign a font size. So Tailwind's font size scale starts at text XS for extra small and goes all the way up to text 6XL for 6 extra large. I think what we want here is something sort of in the middle, maybe something like text 2XL. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I like how the text wraps there. Next, let's tackle the font weight on this heading. So you can see right now we're just using the normal font weight, which I think is a little bit light for a heading. So to set the font weight in Tailwind, we can just use the font utilities, and these go all the way from hairline, which is really thin, all the way up to black, which is kind of the boldest font. I think for our purposes, just something like font bold, which is font weight 700, will look pretty good. Now, what about the color? Right now, this is black by default. And if you look closely, you can see this is a lot darker than this text up here, which also kind of feels black, but looks a lot softer when you compare it to this. Now, most designers tend to not actually use true black in their designs because it looks a little bit unnatural. Usually they're using sort of a dark gray color. So why don't we try changing this text to be dark gray? We can do something like text gray 900 to get the darkest gray, and that's a little bit softer and looks a little bit less unnatural. Now, what about the line height? It looks like this text is actually spaced out a little bit more than it needs to be for being at such a large size. We can change the line height in Tailwind using the leading utilities, which is the typographical term for line height. So we can go with something like leading none, which is a really tight line height, and we can take this all the way up to leading loose, which is sort of the tallest line height in Tailwind. I think something like leading tight, which is tight but not too tight, will look pretty good in our situation. Yeah, I like that. Now, how about this take advantage of it text? If you remember from the final design, this was a different color than this text. So why don't we pull this content down here, and we'll add a span around this text so that we can style it a little bit differently. So I'll pull this onto its own line so we kind of have a little bit more room to work with it. And let's add a class attribute to the span. So all we really want to do here is change the color. So we can do something like text, and then we just have to pick a color. Now the color in the logo is indigo, which is sort of like a color in between blue and purple. So why don't we try and match the color from the logo? We can do something like text indigo 400. That's a little bit light. What about text indigo 500? Yeah, that looks great. Okay, moving on to the sort of paragraph text that was underneath the heading. So let's add a p tag here and drop in some content. So we can say workcation helps you find work-friendly rentals in beautiful locations so you can enjoy some nice weather even when you're not on vacation. Bit of a mouthful, but there we go. Okay, so let's start by adding a little bit of spacing above it like we did with the other elements. Maybe something like MT4, since we do want it to feel sort of attached to the headline in some way. And honestly, I think we could even go a little bit tighter, maybe MT2. Yeah, that looks pretty good to me. Now, what about the color? Right now, this is black. We know that we don't want to use black. Ideally, we want to use like a dark gray. But I think we also want this text to maybe be a little bit softer than the headline, so it doesn't really compete with it too much. So why don't we try something like text gray 600 and see how that looks? Yeah, that's pretty good. What about 700? Is 700 too dark? That's not too bad either, but I think I actually like 600 more. Okay, so the final piece here was this call to action button at the bottom. So since buttons are inline or inline block elements by default, why don't we add a container here that we can throw this button into? So let's make the button actually a link, because even though it looks like a button, it's actually going to take someone to a different page on the site, not submit a form or anything like that. So we'll create a link here. We'll just have this go nowhere since this is just a demo, and we'll just throw in some text here. Maybe book your escape, I think is what we had. Okay, so now we have this totally unstyled link. Let's bring this to life and make it feel more like a button. So first, let's add a little bit of spacing. So I'm going to add the spacing to the div, since the div is the block level element. So let's try something like MT4. And now we have a little bit of space. Things are looking a little bit better. Okay, let's add a class to this link element and actually style it to look like a button. So first things first, links are inline elements by default, which means you can't actually add padding to them properly. So let's make this inline block so that it accepts padding gracefully. And now why don't we add a background color so we can actually see what the padding would look like when we add it. So maybe we'll go with something like indigo 500 to match our text color. See what that looks like. Yep, there we go. Let's make the text white so it's a little bit more readable. And now let's add a little bit of padding. So we can do something maybe like px4, py2 to start. See what that looks like. Yeah, that's pretty good. Now why don't we add some border radius to sort of match the personality that we have in the image above. We can go with maybe rounded LG on the button as well. See what that looks like. That looks pretty good. I think though, because we cut off so much surface area of the button by chopping off the corners, it makes it seem like maybe we need a little bit more padding. So why don't we try something like px5, py3, kind of have this nice beefy button. Yeah, I think that looks really good. Next, let's add a shadow, kind of like we have with the image. So I think something like shadow LG would probably be pretty good. Not quite as extreme as we had for the image, but still sort of a nice diffused shadow. And yeah, that looks great. Now, what about the text itself? Right now, it's just basically unstyled, regular font weight, all that stuff. Let's make it a little bit more interesting. Why don't we try uppercasing this text to make it a little bit more dramatic? Yeah, that looks pretty good. Now, usually when you uppercase text, you often need to add a little bit of letter spacing to make it a little bit more readable. So we can add letter spacing in Tailwind using the tracking utilities. And tracking, again, is the typographical term for letter spacing. So we could go with something like maybe tracking wider, which will add a little bit of spacing between the letters and make it a little bit easier to read. Now what about the font weight? Right now it's just a regular font weight. Why don't we try bumping it up to be slightly bolder so the button is a little bit more emphasized. Maybe something like font semi-bold, which is font weight 600. And yeah, that looks pretty good. But now that we have this sort of bold uppercase text, it kind of makes the text feel a little bit too big. So why don't we bring the font size down a little bit, maybe to text SM, and see how that looks. Yeah, I think this looks really good. So there you have it. We put together this nice little simple splash page. And the cool thing about it is that we did all of this work without actually having to write a single line of custom CSS. We're able to put together this fairly custom looking design, relying only on the default utilities built into Tailwind. In the next lesson, let's tackle making this design responsive, again, without having to write a single line of custom CSS.